David Harris was walking home from work on a quiet evening, the sun dipping low behind the trees, painting the streets in warm shades of orange and gold. His day had been long but ordinary, filled with lessons, paperwork, and small talk with the students. He carried his bag over his shoulder and thought about dinner with his family, hoping to relax after another routine day. As he turned the corner onto his street, he noticed a police car parked awkwardly near his neighbor's house. The flashing lights caught his attention, but he didn't think much of it at first. Assuming it was just a routine patrol, he walked a little faster toward his home, feeling the crisp air on his face. Suddenly, two officers approached him, their expressions serious and their hands hovering near their belts. "Sir, we need you to come with us," one of them said firmly, leaving no room for questions. David froze for a moment, confusion flashing across his face. "Excuse me? I don't understand. Why am I being stopped?" he asked calmly, trying to keep his voice steady. The officers repeated their instructions, insisting he needed to come to the station for questioning. David glanced around, noticing neighbors peeking from their windows, whispers spreading quickly through the quiet street. Everyone seemed surprised, as he was well known in the area for being polite, helpful, and completely law-abiding. Inside the patrol car, David remained composed. Even as his mind raced, he thought about his family, especially his young daughter, and worried about how this sudden turn of events would affect them. The officers didn't offer explanations, glancing at each other as if unsure about why he was being detained. Their radios crackled with static as they tried to verify his information, but everything seemed normal, which made the situation even more confusing. Meanwhile, a few neighbors had gathered on the sidewalks, whispering among themselves. "Why would they take David? He's always been such a good man," one elderly neighbor murmured. Her voice carried a mix of concern and disbelief, and she wasn't alone. Others shook their heads, trying to make sense of the unusual scene. David's reputation in the community as a kind, honest, and responsible person made it almost impossible for anyone to imagine him involved in any wrongdoing. As the car moved slowly toward the station, David tried to remain calm, offering polite answers whenever the officers asked routine questions. "I have no idea why this is happening, but I promise I will cooperate," he said sincerely. His tone was respectful, but there was a subtle firmness, a quiet confidence that something about him was not ordinary. The officers couldn't quite put their finger on it, and their growing uncertainty added to the tension inside the car. David's thoughts wandered to his family again, picturing the worried faces of his wife and children. He hoped someone would call them to explain the situation, or at least let them know he was safe. As the city lights reflected on the car windows, he noticed the strange looks of passing drivers and pedestrians. Some stared curiously, while others quickly turned away, sensing that something unusual was happening. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the engine and the occasional crackle from the police radio. David wondered if this was a mistake, or if someone had reported him for something he didn't do. He replayed the events of the day in his mind, trying to find any reason that could explain this, but nothing came to mind. He was just a regular man, walking home after a regular day. Yet here he was, being treated as a suspect in a situation that made no sense. By the time the car reached the police station, David's composure never wavered. He stepped out calmly, greeting the officers politely, even as a crowd of curious onlookers gathered outside the station. Their whispers grew louder, and speculation filled the air. Everyone seemed eager to know why a man like David, so respected and ordinary, was suddenly being detained. The tension was palpable, setting the stage for a shocking revelation that nobody, not even David, could have predicted. And as the doors of the station closed behind him, David took a deep breath, knowing that what was about to unfold would change everything. This was no ordinary evening, and no ordinary arrest. Something hidden beneath the surface was about to come to light, something that would leave everyone speechless. Inside the police station, David Harris sat quietly on a hard chair, his hands resting calmly on his lap. The room was sterile, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that reflected off the pale walls. The officers around him were whispering to each other, flipping through papers and typing quickly on their computers, trying to make sense of why a man like David had been detained. Their faces showed confusion, and for the first time, A hint of doubt crept into their expressions. David remained composed. Watching everything carefully, he noticed small details, the way the officers exchanged glances, the rhythm of the typing, the sound of the ticking clock. Every small movement told him that they were trying to uncover something, but the truth was still hidden. He spoke only when asked direct questions, answering politely and clearly. Yet there was a quiet strength in his voice, a sense that he was no ordinary man. Meanwhile, the officers ran his identification through multiple databases, searching for any clue or record that could explain the complaint or alert that had led to his detention. But each search came up empty. No criminal history, no pending cases, nothing to suggest that David had done anything wrong. The officers began to murmur among themselves, a mixture of embarrassment and growing curiosity spreading through the room. One junior officer couldn't hide his frustration. "I don't understand. He seems normal. Nothing in the system matches," he said nervously. His colleague nodded. "Yeah, it's almost like we stopped the wrong person." The lead officer, older and more experienced, raised an eyebrow. Studying David closely, he could sense that this man had a presence beyond what he saw on the surface. Something about him didn't quite fit the ordinary mold. As the minutes passed, David's family began to call. Their worried voices came through the station's phone. The officers relayed messages, but the family could not understand why he was being held at home. His wife paced anxiously, trying to keep calm for their children, but her heart raced with fear and confusion. How could this happen to a man like David, who had never harmed anyone in his life? While the officers were busy trying to verify his identity, small flashes of David's past crept into his mind. Memories he had long kept private surfaced. Moments of responsibility, courage, and quiet heroism. He had once been entrusted with tasks that required absolute secrecy and discretion. But no one around him, not even the neighbors or colleagues, knew anything about it. Now, in this tense moment, those memories felt strangely relevant, as if the past was quietly waiting to reveal itself. The senior officer decided to dig deeper. Checking records that were not typically accessed in routine situations, he discovered fragments of unusual credentials, old certificates, and references that didn't match the typical civilian profile. Slowly, the room's atmosphere shifted from confusion to intrigue. The officers exchanged whispers, realizing that there might be more to David than they could see at first glance. David noticed the subtle change in their behavior. He remained calm, offering answers without panic. Yet he knew the truth was only a matter of time before it came out. His patience was quiet, measured, and almost deliberate. He had faced situations in the past that demanded more courage and composure than this. This was a test of patience, not strength, and he had it in abundance. Outside, curious onlookers waited for updates, whispers spreading through the streets. Some speculated wildly, imagining reasons that had no basis in reality. Others simply shook their heads, unable to comprehend why a man like David could be in such a situation. The tension built not only inside the station, but beyond its walls, as the community began to sense that something extraordinary was unfolding. As the day stretched on, the officers continued their investigation, documents and screens piling up on the desks. The young officer who had first stopped David looked uneasy, realizing that assumptions could be dangerous. The lead officer leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully, sensing that this was not a simple case of misidentification. He felt the stirrings of an astonishing discovery, one that could change everything about this unexpected arrest. And through it all, David sat quietly, the calm in the storm, waiting patiently, knowing that soon the truth about who he really was would come to light, something that would leave everyone in the room stunned, speechless, and forced to rethink everything they thought they knew about the man in front of them. The investigation inside the station had shifted from confusion to cautious curiosity. David Harris sat upright, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the growing tension around him. Officers whispered and typed furiously, scanning databases and cross-referencing his identity. But nothing seemed to add up. Every record showed a law-abiding citizen, a devoted husband, and a respected member of the community. Yet their instincts told them that there was more beneath the surface. David answered questions politely, never raising his voice, his eyes steady and observant. Each question they asked seemed routine, yet the way they asked it revealed their unease. The younger officers grew impatient, whispering doubts to one another, while the senior officer leaned back in his chair, analyzing, trying to understand why such an ordinary man had caused such an extraordinary reaction. As the computer screens flickered, one officer discovered a small detail that didn't fit. It was an old file buried in the archives, nearly forgotten, containing references to assignments that seemed unusual for someone in David's civilian life. The senior officer's eyes narrowed as he leaned closer, reading the details carefully. There was no crime, no violation, just something odd, something that hinted at a life David had kept entirely separate from the public. Meanwhile, David's mind wandered briefly to his past, memories he had kept secret, responsibilities that had required discretion, courage, and trust, tasks that demanded more secrecy than most could imagine. He remembered the sense of duty, the weight of knowing that one mistake could have consequences far beyond anything ordinary. He had lived many years quietly, blending into society, helping others without recognition. And now, those hidden chapters seemed ready to surface. The officers continued their questioning, trying to piece together the story from fragments. David provided clear and precise answers, but he did not reveal everything. He did not need to, because the truth had a way of revealing itself when the time was right. One officer began to notice subtle inconsistencies in the paperwork, slight errors that suggested that David had once held positions of trust that were highly unusual. The senior officer motioned for quiet, his instincts telling him that they were on the verge of a discovery. Outside the room, the atmosphere was tense. The whispers of neighbors and curious onlookers grew louder as the news of David's detention spread. Phones rang with anxious family members, friends, and colleagues calling for answers. Inside, the officers worked diligently, scanning archives, verifying credentials, and slowly uncovering the hidden details of David's past. Each discovery raised more questions than answers, yet the mystery became more compelling. David remained silent for much of the process, observing, listening, and maintaining his calm. His patience was almost deliberate, a quiet confidence that only someone who had faced far greater challenges could possess. He knew that the right moment would come, when the truth about his identity could no longer be ignored or hidden. As the day wore on, the senior officer gathered the team, pointing out the unusual credentials and records. "Look at this," he said, his voice low but firm. "Nothing here is criminal, but it's clear that this man's background is extraordinary. We need to understand what these files really mean." The team leaned in, scanning the details, a mixture of awe and disbelief on their faces. David's presence filled the room with quiet authority. Even without a word, the officers felt it. The sense that this man had experienced things far beyond the ordinary, that there was a depth to him that went unnoticed until now. Every glance, every gesture, every calm answer suggested that he was someone who had lived a life of purpose and significance hidden from the world. Finally, the senior officer sat back, letting the reality sink in. He realized that David was not just an ordinary citizen, not just a husband or neighbor, but someone whose true identity carried weight, responsibility, and history. Something extraordinary, something that could explain why even a simple detainment had felt so unusual. The pieces were slowly falling into place, and soon, the shocking truth would be revealed to everyone in the room, leaving them stunned, speechless, and completely unprepared for what they were about to discover. The senior officer leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on David Harris, a mixture of curiosity and disbelief washing over him. He motioned for the team to stop the routine questioning and focus on the unusual records they had uncovered. Papers lay scattered across the desk, old documents, certificates, and references that hinted at a life far beyond what anyone in the room could imagine. The room was quiet except for the hum of computers and the occasional rustle of paper, the tension thick and almost palpable. David remained calm, his hands folded neatly on his lap, observing every movement. Every glance and whisper from the officers seemed to confirm what he already knew, that the truth about his past was about to come to light. He did not flinch, he did not panic, because he had faced moments far more intense than this. moments where his identity and actions have been matters of life and death. One officer finally broke the silence, his voice a mix of nervousness and awe. "Sir, these files, they don't make sense. They show assignments, responsibilities, things that no ordinary citizen would ever have." The senior officer nodded slowly. "Exactly. And that's why this situation is not just unusual. It's extraordinary. We need to verify these documents, but at first glance, it's clear that there is something remarkable about him." David's mind wandered briefly, recalling the missions and tasks he had undertaken years ago. He had always lived quietly, helping in ways that nobody would ever know, protecting secrets, assisting in operations that required absolute discretion, always ensuring that the work was done and no recognition was given. Now, sitting in a police station, detained for no reason, the irony was not lost on him. The world was about to see just a fragment of what he had done, though even this was only a glimpse. The officers continued to dig, cross-checking names, dates, and references. Each piece of information seemed to contradict the simple image of David they had in their minds. The calm neighbor, the ordinary teacher, the devoted husband. How could he also be someone whose life had carried so much responsibility and secrecy? Questions piled up, murmurs filled the room, and curiosity turned to astonishment as more anomalies surfaced. Meanwhile, the younger officers began to realize the gravity of the situation. "I've never seen anything like this," one whispered. "It's as if we've been sitting next to someone who's lived a completely different life without us even knowing." The lead officer raised his hand, signaling for silence. "Focus! Everyone, we need to verify the facts before jumping to conclusions. But make no mistake, this is unusual, and it demands respect." David's calm presence seemed to affect the room, a quiet authority that made everyone sit up and pay attention. He did not need to speak. The truth of his life was starting to show through the documents and files. Each certificate, each reference hinted at skills, missions, and responsibilities that were far beyond ordinary comprehension. The officers could sense that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a truth hidden beneath layers of everyday life. Time passed slowly, tension building with every passing minute. The senior officer carefully examined a set of old files, realizing that David's contributions had been critical in ways that the public could never know. "This explains a lot," he murmured, almost to himself. No wonder he seemed different, capable, composed in a way most men aren't. The room felt smaller, as if the weight of David's hidden past pressed against the walls, demanding recognition. Outside, the whispers of neighbors and curious onlookers continued, though none could imagine what was unfolding inside. Inside, the officers' skepticism gave way to wonder. Their initial assumptions about an ordinary man being detained had completely unraveled. The calm, polite, unassuming figure of David Harris was slowly revealing layers that left them astonished, uncertain how to proceed. Finally, the senior officer looked at David, his voice steady but filled with respect. "Mr. Harris, it appears there's far more to your story than we could have imagined. We need to understand your true identity before proceeding any further." David nodded subtly, his calm demeanor unwavering, knowing that the revelation of his hidden life was imminent. Something remarkable, powerful, and entirely unexpected was about to come to light, and everyone in the room would be left speechless. The senior officer took a deep breath, scanning the room, knowing that what they were about to uncover would change everything. David Harris remained calm, sitting upright, his hands folded on his lap, his face showing the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far greater challenges in life. The officers gathered around the scattered documents, studying each file, certificate, and old reference, trying to piece together a story that no one had expected. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place, revealing a man whose ordinary appearance masked an extraordinary past. David had once served in a highly sensitive government role, a position that required absolute secrecy, courage, and precision. His work had demanded that he remain invisible, that no one outside a select few should know of his actions. The file showed assignments that were unusual for a civilian, missions that required discretion, intelligence, and bravery. The junior officer's eyes widened as he read. This "This can't be real," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. The senior officer nodded. "It is real, and we almost mishandled someone whose contributions have been critical." The room grew silent, the weight of realization pressing down on everyone. For the first time, the officers understood that David's calmness, his composure, and his quiet authority were not ordinary traits, but the marks of someone trained to face extreme situations. With patience and precision, David remained quiet, watching the reactions of the officers, knowing that the truth was finally coming to light. His past was not meant for recognition, and yet here it was, unraveling before the eyes of people who had judged him only by appearances. The files revealed covert operations, acts of bravery, and responsibilities that had protected countless lives without ever being known to the public. Each discovery left the officers more astonished, struggling to reconcile the man before them, with the hero hidden in plain sight. The senior officer finally spoke, his voice steady but filled with awe. "Mr. Harris, it seems that everything we assumed about you is wrong. You are not just an ordinary citizen. You have served in ways that few could even imagine." David nodded subtly, his calm expression unchanged. He understood the officer's shock, but he had grown used to keeping extraordinary deeds hidden from the world. One officer, younger and less experienced, hesitated, then asked, "Sir, why didn't anyone know about this before? How is it possible that someone with such a record is walking freely among us?" The senior officer glanced at David, realizing that the question could only be answered with respect. Because he was meant to be invisible, his work required it, and that is why even the authorities nearby had no idea of his identity. His past is classified, and yet here we are, finally seeing a glimpse of it. David's thoughts drifted briefly to the sacrifices he had made, the years of service without acknowledgement, the constant vigilance, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his work had made a difference. He had chosen a life of humility, never seeking fame or credit. Yet now, circumstances had forced that life into the light. The officers exchanged looks of astonishment, disbelief, and respect, realizing that they had almost treated a national hero like any other suspect. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone. A man detained for no cause turned out to be someone whose contributions had likely saved countless lives, whose identity had been intentionally hidden for the greater good. Outside, the whispers of the crowd grew louder, yet none of them could imagine the depth of David's hidden life. Inside the room, the officers were silent, absorbing the reality of what had just been revealed. The senior officer shook his head slowly, muttering, "We underestimated him, and we were wrong." David simply nodded, letting them understand without needing to explain further. The truth had spoken for itself. Finally, the room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension giving way to a mixture of awe and respect. David's ordinary demeanor had hidden an extraordinary identity, and the officers realized that appearances could never capture the full story. What began as a routine and baffling detention had turned into a revelation that left everyone in the room stunned, speechless, and profoundly humbled. The room was heavy with silence, the kind that comes when people realize they are standing in the presence of someone extraordinary. David Harris sat calmly, his posture relaxed, his eyes steady, yet the weight of his past seemed to ripple through the air. The officers around him were still processing the revelation, flipping through the files again, trying to understand the scale of what they had just discovered. Their earlier confusion had turned into astonishment, mixed with a quiet respect that none of them had expected. The senior officer leaned forward, rubbing his temples. "I can't believe this. We almost treated a man like him as if he were an ordinary suspect," he muttered. His voice carried a mix of regret and awe. The younger officers exchanged glances, their faces pale, realizing that they had underestimated someone who had lived a life filled with responsibility, danger, and secrecy. David's presence in the room seemed to command a quiet authority, not through words, but through the calm assurance of someone who had faced far greater challenges. He did not need to explain everything, because the documents, the references, and the realization in the officer's eyes were enough to tell the story. Every detail of his past hinted at missions and responsibilities that were highly classified. Lives protected and crises averted without anyone outside, a select few knowing. One officer, still struggling to grasp it all, asked hesitantly, "Sir, you mean to say all these years, all these operations, we had no idea?" The senior officer shook his head. "Exactly. And that's why this situation is so extraordinary. He has lived among us as a normal citizen. Yet his contributions, his sacrifices, they are beyond anything we could imagine." The room seemed to shrink as the realization sank in. David's calmness and composure suddenly made perfect sense, his ordinary appearance masking a life of hidden heroism. David finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "I never sought recognition for any of it, and I never expected anyone to know. The work was never about credit. It was about responsibility, about protecting others without them even realizing it." The words carried a quiet weight, as if the calm itself were proof of the extraordinary life he had led. The officers listened, captivated, understanding for the first time that this man had lived a life far beyond their comprehension. The senior officer motioned for the team to gather closer, showing them more of the hidden documents, each one a fragment of missions that required courage, intelligence, and discretion. Every page seemed to add to the astonishment, and every detail revealed why David had remained composed even when detained. It was not fearlessness alone. It was experience, training, and the understanding that his identity was meant to remain hidden until necessary. The younger officers whispered among themselves, realizing how close they had come to mishandling someone who had protected countless lives. The irony was not lost on them, that a routine detainment had turned into a discovery of heroism. The senior officer shook his head slowly, muttering, "We judged him by appearances and almost made a mistake we'll never forget." His voice carried the gravity of the lesson learned, that assumptions could never capture the true measure of a person. Outside the station, the crowd continued to murmur, though no one yet understood the depth of what had unfolded inside. Inside, the officers began to change their approach, treating David with the respect that his life and work demanded. The earlier tension was replaced by awe, humility, and an unspoken understanding that they were witnessing something rare, something extraordinary. David remained calm, his presence a silent reminder that the most remarkable people often go unnoticed. The quiet dignity of his character, paired with the revelations of his hidden life, left everyone in the room speechless, their assumptions shattered, their understanding transformed. The ordinary man before them was, in truth, a hero whose identity had remained secret for a reason, and whose calm in the face of unjust detention now spoke louder than any words could. Finally, the senior officer leaned back, exhaling slowly. "We need to handle this carefully. We almost lost sight of what truly matters. We need to respect the life he's lived and the work he's done." The room was silent, except for the faint hum of computers and the occasional shuffle of paper. The officers were humbled, astonished, and fully aware that what had started as a routine detainment had become an unforgettable lesson in humility, respect, and the hidden depths of human courage. News of David Harris's detention had spread quickly. Though the details were still murky, neighbors whispered to each other on the sidewalks, imagining reasons for why a man like David could be held. Phones rang at his home, friends and family anxious for answers. His wife paced nervously, her heart heavy with worry. She could not understand how a man so ordinary, so kind, could suddenly become the center of such attention. Inside the station, the officers had confirmed David's extraordinary past, and the news began to leak, slowly at first, then faster. As journalists picked up the story, headlines appeared online and in newspapers. "Man detained without cause. Turns out to be hidden hero. Local residents' secret life revealed." The public was stunned, unable to reconcile the polite, calm neighbor they knew with the man who had served in secret, saving countless lives. David, meanwhile, remained composed, his calmness unshaken by the sudden attention. He answered questions politely, clarifying only what was necessary, never seeking recognition or fame. His focus was on his family and ensuring the situation did not spiral into chaos. He understood the curiosity, But he also knew that most of his work was meant to remain unseen, even now. He revealed only a fraction of what had happened, enough to explain, but not to boast. The senior officer, once confused and frustrated, now looked at David with profound respect. "We almost treated a national hero like a common suspect," he said quietly, shaking his head. The other officers nodded, humbled by the realization. Their assumptions about ordinary appearances had been shattered. Their admiration for David grew as they understood the courage, intelligence, and humility it took to live a life like his. Media outlets covered the story with fascination, highlighting the irony of a man detained for no reason turning out to be someone whose identity and work had been intentionally hidden. Social media buzzed with reactions, viewers expressing awe, disbelief, and admiration. "He walked among us unnoticed," one comment read. "A hero hiding in plain sight." The story went viral, not because of scandal or controversy, but because of the remarkable contrast between ordinary appearance and extraordinary life. At home, David's family finally breathed a sigh of relief. Their worry had been replaced by pride, though they had always known he was a remarkable man. The children hugged him tightly, sensing the gravity of what had happened even without fully understanding it. His wife looked at him with a mixture of awe and love, realizing that the quiet, unassuming man she had always known carried secrets far beyond her imagination. The officers began reflecting on their own actions, realizing the danger of assumptions. The senior officer called the team together, saying, "We need to remember this. Never judge someone by appearances alone. There are people whose contributions and sacrifices go unseen, and we must respect that." The words carried a lesson that went beyond the arrest, beyond the station, touching on humanity, humility, and the power of quiet heroism. David, however, remained grounded, emphasizing that the story was not about him, but about the unseen work that protects society. "Recognition is not what matters," he told the media. "The goal is to serve, to protect, and to help others, even if nobody knows." His humility only deepened the public's respect, inspiring countless people to reflect on their own assumptions and the hidden courage around them. By the end of the day, the story had transformed from one of confusion and tension to one of awe and inspiration. The man who had been detained without cause became a symbol of hidden heroism, humility, and quiet strength. People everywhere discussed the lesson. Appearances can deceive. Ordinary lives may hide extraordinary truths, and true courage often goes unnoticed until revealed. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the city, David returned home, greeted by his family. Neighbors watched respectfully, whispering about the calm man who had saved lives without them ever knowing. The police officers left the station, changed by the encounter, carrying a lesson in humility and awe that would stay with them forever. In the quiet of his home, David smiled softly, knowing that his work, his life, and his identity had left an impact, not through recognition, but through the power of unseen courage. The days after David Harris's story went public were filled with a mix of reflection, admiration, and quiet awe. Inside the police station, officers replayed the events in their minds, realizing how close they had come to mishandling someone whose life had been extraordinary. The senior officer often shook his head, muttering, "We judged too quickly. We almost lost sight of what truly matters." Each member of the team carried a newfound respect for appearances, for patience, and for the hidden strength that ordinary people might possess. At home, David returned to his routine, but life felt subtly different. He walked the familiar streets of his neighborhood with a sense of calm pride, knowing that his work, though largely invisible, had finally touched people's hearts. The neighbors who had once whispered in confusion now greeted him with smiles, quiet nods, and a deep respect. Their perception of him shifted from ordinary citizen to someone extraordinary, a man who had walked among them unnoticed, yet had shaped lives in ways they could never imagine. David's children clung to him, proud but curious, asking questions about the attention their father had received. He answered carefully, speaking in simple words about responsibility, courage, and humility, teaching them that the work one does should never be for recognition, but for the right reason. That true strength is measured by integrity, compassion, and selflessness, not by fame or acknowledgement. The media continued to cover the story, highlighting the lessons in humility, perception, and hidden heroism. Articles, videos, and social posts circulated widely, inspiring conversations in homes, schools, and workplaces. People reflected on the idea that the world is full of unsung heroes, ordinary lives carrying extraordinary impact, and that assumptions can never reveal the depth of a person. Meanwhile, the police officers involved continued their work, but they had changed. The experience left a lasting impression, teaching them to look beyond the surface, to question assumptions, and to approach every situation with patience and care. The junior officer who had first detained David often thought about the calm confidence he had witnessed, realizing that composure and courage can exist in the most unassuming forms. David himself never sought to capitalize on the attention. He preferred quiet moments with his family, teaching his children lessons not through words alone, but through example, showing them the value of honesty, integrity, and courage. He understood that the greatest impact often comes from the unseen, from the actions that shape the world without being noticed. As the weeks passed, the story became more than a viral sensation. It became a symbol of humility, the power of patience, and the importance of looking deeper. The city slowly absorbed the lesson, realizing that heroism is often hidden, that the ordinary can conceal the extraordinary, and that respect and understanding should precede judgment. One evening, as David watched the sun set from his porch, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The world had seen a glimpse of his life, but more importantly, the message had reached those willing to understand it. His family gathered around him, laughing and sharing stories, unaware of the lasting impact this episode would have on the police officers, the community, and the strangers who had read about him. In the end, David Harris returned fully to his life. Yet nothing was quite the same. The experience had left an imprint, a reminder that courage, humility, and integrity are timeless, invisible forces that shape lives, communities, and the world. He had faced an unexpected arrest, endured doubt and scrutiny, yet his calm, measured response and the truth of his hidden identity had turned confusion into admiration, suspicion into respect, and ordinary assumptions into awe. And as the night fell, quiet and peaceful over the city, David smiled softly, knowing that what mattered most was not the recognition he had received, but the unseen difference he had made. The ordinary man with extraordinary courage had walked among the world, unnoticed by many, yet unforgettable to those who had truly understood him, leaving behind a lesson in humility, respect, and the power of living with purpose.